September 1944 witnessed the unstoppable momentum of General George Patton suddenly collide with a wall of ancient stone and modern steel at the gates of Metz. As Patton and General Walton Walker faced an invisible subterranean enemy, a single question haunted the Allied High Command. Could the master of mobile warfare survive a battle where there was nowhere to run? The late summer sun of 1944 should have illuminated a path directly into the heart of the Third Reich. Yet for the men of the United States Third Army, the light was fading into a cold, oppressive autumn gray. General George S. Patton, the flamboyant architect of the breakthrough at Saint-Lô, stood atop a command jeep, his ivory-handled revolvers catching the dimming light as he gazed toward the horizon of the Moselle River. Behind him lay the liberation of Paris and the exhilarating race across the French countryside. But ahead loomed a nightmare of geography and geometry known as the fortress city of Metz. Patton's logistical reality was beginning to fracture as the Red Ball Express supply lines stretched to their absolute breaking point, leaving his vaunted Sherman tanks parched for fuel and his artillery batteries rationing shells. While General Dwight D. Eisenhower grappled with the competing egos of the Allied High Command, Patton remained convinced that audacity alone would carry his forces over the Moselle before the German Wehrmacht could recover its breath. However, the German First Army, under the calculated leadership of General Otto von Knobelsdorff, was not merely retreating, it was falling back into one of the most sophisticated defensive systems ever devised by man. Metz was not a single target, but a sprawling constellation of 43 interconnected forts, a defensive masterwork refined over centuries by French and German engineers alike. At the center of this lethal web sat Fort Driant, a subterranean leviathan of reinforced concrete and armored steel that commanded the high ground southwest of the city. To Patton, these fortifications were archaic relics, obstacles that could be bypassed or bullied into submission through sheer aggressive spirit. He famously dismissed the city as a pushover, a fatal miscalculation that ignored the tactical evolution of the German defenders who had turned these 19th century shells into 20th century killing zones. The strategic importance of Fort Driant cannot be overstated, as its 150mm guns could sweep the Moselle Valley with surgical precision, making any Allied crossing a suicidal endeavor. General Walton Walker, commander of the 20th Corps, shared Patton's aggressive temperament, yet even he began to feel the weight of the tactical reports filtering back from the front lines. The terrain surrounding the fort was a jagged labyrinth of ravines, thick forests, and open kill zones, all meticulously mapped by German forward observers who had spent weeks pre-calculating every square inch of the approach for their heavy mortars. Primary sources from the 5th Infantry Division's war diaries describe the atmosphere as one of mounting dread, where the American soldiers, trained for fast-moving maneuvers, suddenly found themselves preparing for a type of warfare their grandfathers had endured in the trenches of 1917. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and cordite as the first probing attacks began, revealing a terrifying truth. The American 105mm howitzers, usually the hammer of the Third Army, were merely scratching the surface of the 7-foot-thick concrete carapaces protecting the German gunners. Inside the damp, dimly lit corridors of Fort Driant, the German defenders lived a subterranean existence, sheltered from the torrential rains and the screaming metal of Allied airstrikes. These were not the broken remnants of a defeated army, but a professional cadre of officers and motivated cadets from the Metz Officer Candidate School, men who viewed the defense of the fortress as a matter of Prussian honor. They moved through a network of tunnels that allowed them to relocate entire platoons from one side of the fort to the other without ever exposing a single helmet to the American snipers watching from the woods. The first major assault, designated Operation Casanova, was launched with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, as Patton believed the German morale would shatter at the first sight of American steel. On the morning of September 27, the men of the 2nd Battalion, 11th Infantry Regiment, moved out under a flickering umbrella of white phosphorus and smoke. They climbed the steep, muddy slopes of the fort, their boots slipping on the slick grass as the German MG-42 machine guns began their rhythmic, terrifying chatter. It was here that the tactical nightmare truly revealed itself, for as the American infantry reached the outer perimeter of the fort, they found themselves entangled in a web of deep-set barbed wire and hidden minefields. The fort's design utilized disappearing armored turrets, which would rise from the ground to unleash a storm of fire before retracting back into the safety of the earth. To the American GIs, it felt as though the very ground was breathing fire, and for every yard gained, the price was paid in the lifeblood of the Third Army's finest infantrymen. Patton's frustration boiled over in his private journals, where he lamented the lack of heavy bunker-busting munitions and the agonizingly slow progress of the 22nd Corps. He pressured Walker to increase the tempo, refusing to accept that the principles of mobile warfare were being strangled by the static reality of the Moselle defenses. The leadership dilemma was stark. To continue the frontal assault was to risk the destruction of entire regiments, but to bypass the fort was to leave a lethal dagger pointed at the Third Army's flank. By the third day of the assault, the Americans had managed to seize a foothold on the roof of the fort, a Pyrrhic victory that brought them no closer to actual control. They stood atop the concrete behemoth, dropping grenades and satchel charges down ventilation shafts, only to hear the muffled explosions, followed by the defiant return fire of German submachine guns. The war had moved from the open fields into a vertical, three-dimensional hell, where the enemy was always beneath your feet, waiting for the cover of darkness to emerge from hidden sally ports and launch counterattacks. The psychological toll on the American commanders was immense, as the casualty list grew longer with each passing hour. General Walker, realizing that his men were being devoured in a meat grinder, authorized the use of experimental tactics, including the mounting of flamethrowers on tanks and the use of massive quantities of gasoline to flush the Germans out of the tunnels. Yet the fortress swallowed everything they threw at it, its vents protected by steel baffles, and its internal doors reinforced to withstand the pressure of heavy explosions. In the command bunkers of the German First Army, Knobelsdorff watched the Americans struggle with a grim satisfaction, knowing that every day Patton was pinned down at Metz was another day the west wall defenses were being strengthened. He understood that Patton's greatest strength, his speed, was being neutralized by the sheer mass of the fortifications, turning the Ghost Corps into a static target for German long-range artillery. Declassified reports from the era reveal that the American intelligence failure was catastrophic, as they had underestimated the depth of the fort's tunnel system and the sheer resilience of the garrison. The soldiers on the ground were forced to improvise, using welding torches to cut through steel doors while under constant fire from hidden embrasures. The battle had devolved into a series of brutal, small-unit actions where the individual courage of the American private was the only thing preventing a total rout. As the first week of October arrived, the rain turned the battlefield into a quagmire of freezing mud, making it nearly impossible to evacuate the wounded or bring up fresh ammunition. The men of the 5th Infantry Division were exhausted, their uniforms caked in filth, and their spirits dampened by the realization that the fort they had been told would fall in hours was now a permanent tomb for many of their comrades. Patton, for the first time in the war, faced the very real possibility of a tactical defeat that could tarnish his carefully cultivated image of invincibility. The struggle for Fort Driant had become a microcosm of the larger war in Europe, a clash between the innovative spirit of the New World and the stubborn, entrenched traditions of the old. As the sun set on the blood-soaked slopes of the fort, the American flag remained unplanted, and the shadow of the fortress grew longer, cast across the fields of France and into the history books as the place where Patton's pride met its match. The atmosphere at Patton's headquarters at the Caserne Neville in Nancy grew increasingly toxic as the calendar turned toward mid-October. The general, usually a man of decisive action and colorful rhetoric, found himself pacing the stone floors, his mind racing to find a solution to a problem that couldn't be solved by a flanking maneuver or a daring tank charge. The Blood and Guts moniker was taking on a darker meaning, as the blood was primarily American, and the guts were being spilled in a futile effort to crack a shell that wouldn't break. General Eisenhower, observing from Schaeff, began to question if Patton's obsession with Metz was a strategic necessity or a personal vendetta against a city that dared to say no. Inside the fort, the American GIs who had managed to occupy the surface bunkers were living in a state of constant, vibrating terror. The German defenders, familiar with every inch of the subterranean layout, began a campaign of psychological warfare. They would tap on the pipes, their voices echoing through the ventilation shafts, promising the Americans that they would never leave the hill alive. Combat in the tunnels was a claustrophobic nightmare. Men fought with bayonets, trench knives, and pistols in pitch-black corridors where the air was thick with the smoke of discharged weapons and the smell of unwashed bodies. There was no front line here, only a lethal 360-degree environment where death could come from a hole in the ceiling or a trapdoor in the floor. Technical reports from the 20th Corps Ordnance officers highlighted a heartbreaking reality. The American M1 Garand and the Browning automatic rifle were superior in the open field. But in the tight confines of the Driant tunnels, the German MP40 and the shorter Ka or 98K carbines allowed for more maneuverability. The Americans attempted to use beehive charges, massive-shaped explosives, to breach the inner sanctums of the fort. But the German engineers had designed the tunnels with sharp turns and blast baffles that redirected the energy of the explosions back toward the attackers. It was a masterpiece of defensive architecture that turned the Americans' own strength against them. By October 9th, the situation reached a breaking point. General Walker, usually the loyal subordinate, sat down with Patton and presented him with a grim assessment. The 5th Infantry Division was bled white, and the 11th Infantry Regiment was essentially combat ineffective. The weather had turned into a relentless deluge, grounded the P-47 Thunderbolts that Patton relied on for close air support. The Moselle River was rising, threatening to sweep away the precarious bridges that served as the only lifeline for the troops on the hill. For the first time, the word withdrawal was whispered in the war room, a word that Patton loathed with every fiber of his being. Patton's reaction was one of characteristic defiance, yet even he could see the writing on the wall. He knew that the eyes of the world, and more importantly, the eyes of his rivals like Montgomery, were watching. To retreat would be to admit that his philosophy of cavalry warfare had failed in the face of static defense. Yet primary memoirs from his aides-de-camp suggest that beneath the bravado, Patton was deeply troubled by the loss of life for such a meager gain. He authorized a final, desperate attempt to take the fort by flooding the tunnels with burning oil, a move that reflected the sheer desperation of the command. The German response to this final hellstorm was a devastating counter-barrage from the surrounding forts, including Fort Jeanne d'Arc and Fort Somme. The entire sector erupted in a symphony of destruction as the German heavy guns, coordinated by forward observers with overlapping fields of vision, rained steel upon the American positions. The Casanova units were pinned down in the mud, unable to move forward or backward, surviving only by huddling in the very craters created by the German shells. It was the absolute nadir of the Third Army's experience in Europe. On the night of October 12th, under the cover of a thick, sulfurous fog, the order finally came. Cease all offensive operations. Prepare to evacuate. The withdrawal was a somber, silent affair. The Americans muffled their equipment with rags and moved like ghosts down the slopes of the hill they had tried so hard to conquer. They left behind blackened concrete, twisted wire, and the bodies of their brothers that couldn't be recovered under fire. The Germans did not cheer. They simply watched from their embrasures, the silent victors of a battle that had cost both sides dearly. The strategic impact of the failure at Fort Driant was immediate and profound. It forced a total reevaluation of Allied tactics for breaching the Siegfried Line. The myth of the impenetrable fortress was reinforced, giving the German high command a much-needed propaganda victory and a template for how to stall the Allied advance across the entire Western Front. For Patton, it was a humbling lesson that speed is useless if the enemy is literally bolted to the earth. He would eventually take Metz, but not through the frontal assault he had envisioned, and not before the city became a synonym for stalemate in the American military lexicon. Post-war analysis by historians often points to Driant as the moment where Patton's cavalry mindset reached its limit. While he was a genius at exploiting a breakthrough, he lacked the patience for the methodical, attritional warfare required to reduce a fortress. The battle also exposed the friction between the ground commanders and the Air Corps, as the lack of effective bunker-busting aerial munitions meant that the infantry was forced to do the impossible, with nothing but courage and hand grenades. The soldiers who survived the meat grinder of Metz would go on to fight in the Battle of the Bulge, but many claimed that nothing they saw in the Ardennes compared to the subterranean horror of Driant. The fort today stands as a silent monument, its concrete scarred by thousands of bullet hits, and its tunnels still holding the echoes of a battle that history almost forgot. It is a place where the grandeur of military maps met the reality of the mud, and where General George Patton learned that even the most brilliant commander must eventually bow to the geography of war. Ultimately, the fall of Metz in November 1944 was achieved through encirclement and the cutting of supply lines. The very tactics Patton initially bypassed in favor of a direct assault. The cost of learning this lesson was over 40,000 casualties for the XX Corps throughout the entire Metz campaign. The Ghost Corps had earned its name in a way no one had intended, haunted by the memories of the men left behind in the dark, damp halls of the Moselle fortresses. As we look back at the declassified National Archive reports, we see a General Patton who emerged from Metz more cautious, yet more determined. He had been tested by an enemy that wouldn't move, and in that friction, he refined the tactics that would eventually carry him across the Rhine. The failure at Fort Driant wasn't the end of his career, but it was the end of his innocence. The moment he realized that the road to Berlin was paved with more than just speed, it was paved with the grim, slow labor of the infantry. The ghosts of Fort Driant still linger in the cold French rain. For the families of the men of the 5th Infantry Division, the name Metz is not a symbol of victory, but of a quiet, heroic endurance against impossible odds. It serves as a reminder that in World War II, the most significant battles weren't always the ones that moved the lines the furthest, but the ones that tested the soul of the Army to its breaking point. The legacy of the battle remains a subject of intense study at West Point and other military academies, a cautionary tale of hubris, intelligence failure, and the timeless power of the defense. Patton's failure at Fort Driant was perhaps his most human moment, a moment where a legend was forced to face his limitations and a soldier was forced to achieve the extraordinary, even in a losing effort. History judges Patton by his victories, but it understands him through his defeats. Fort Driant was his crucible, a dark chapter in the triumphant narrative of the Third Army that reminds us all that war is rarely a straight line to glory, but a winding path through the shadows of the earth itself. If you were in Patton's position, would you have continued the frontal assault on Fort Driant, or would you have bypassed the city regardless of the risk to your flank? Let me know your tactical reasoning in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.